QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021 Tax Line Mapping Officer Compensation. Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Here we are in our S-Corp test file. We currently have the open windows open. You can open the open windows by going to the View dropdown, selecting the open windows list. In prior presentations, we entered information into our QuickBooks file, including the mapping to line it up to where it would go in the tax return. We exported then to the tax software, and then we did a reconciliation of the tax software to what we have in Excel. What we have in Excel then also being exported from QuickBooks to Excel. So at this point in time, we have reconciled the major three components here in the tax software of the three calculations of basically income. We have the 65,510 on the page 1 of the 1120S, which ties out to the 65,510 here on the Excel worksheet. And then if we go back to the tax return on page 5, we've got the book amount of the 85,714 and the tax amount of the 77,510 here for that reconciliation, which ties out to the 85,714 and the 77,510. Now what I would do going forward is lead with Excel now. So up until this point in time, we've been exporting from QuickBooks into the lucert program and then figuring out what has been done so that we can then reconcile the two in our Excel worksheet. Now, any adjustments from this point going forward, I would first enter into Excel so I can see it in a transparent format, and then enter it into the lucert system, into the tax system, so that if anything goes wrong, I can see where I was before, where I will be after, and see it in terms of a simple journal entry format in Excel to then go back in and fix any problems that will then happen or could then happen. So if I'll go back to page 1 on the tax return, we'll then have this line item here for the salaries and wages. Now we need to break out oftentimes for an S corporation, especially for the owners of the S corporation, the officer compensation, because oftentimes you're required for an S corporation, if you're the owner, oftentimes required to record wages so that you're forced to basically, one reason is to pay the payroll taxes, Social Security, and Medicare. So it's important for us to break these two line items out. Now they weren't being broken out here when we just imported the data into the system. So you might first think, well, how can I set up QuickBooks to fix that in the future so that these two line items will be broken out, the owners of the corporations that have to pay themselves, and an S corporation being broken out to another line item? Well, you could then go into QuickBooks here. If we went into our lists and the chart of accounts, then everything payroll related is mapping to this compensation, or it might be called payroll expense. What we would want to do then is break out another line simply for the payroll for the owners, the officer compensation, and that would have to include just the payroll, not the payroll taxes for the officer compensation. Now here I'll just set up an account so we can see how that could be mapped out differently. If you're processing payroll through QuickBooks, then you would also have to make sure that you set up every time you process the payroll that the item is going to the right place, that it's pointing to two different accounts whenever you run payroll, one being the account for everybody else and the other being for those who, in this case, being the owners and officers. So what we would do is add another account here. We'd want a new account for next year. We'd say planning for next year to make sure to get this correct, so it'll be a little bit easier. We'd then have it as an expense account and continue. And then I would want to just simply call it officer compensation. And then I'm going to select the tax line item, which is going to be now deductions for the compensation of the shareholder, which I believe that's the one that'll link it over and break it out. So then if I say save and close, now we have two items that are basically related to processing the payroll, one for the officer compensation and the other basically for everything else. Again, if you ran payroll within QuickBooks, then you'd have to set up the items such that they would then break out to those two. That would be for next year. And then let's fix it for this year. For this year, we can do the adjustment first in Excel here. So I'm going to say I'm going to reduce the compensation on this side, and then I'm just going to record the other side to officer compensation, which is an account that we need to set up here. So now we just added it to QuickBooks, which I think is a good practice because you can see exactly where it's going to line up, meaning it's going to line up in alphabetical order. So it's under the charitable contributions, but before the depreciation. So I'll try to line it up the same way. So we're going to be over here. It's going to be the officer compensation is going to be, let's check that one more time. That's the normal comp. We want officer, which is below the office supplies. Below the office supplies. So it's going to be right here. So I'm going to select the line below it, and I'm just going to select these 4 cells, right click and insert. Then I'm going to move those cells down just to make another row, and this is going to be officer compensation. Sounds like you're bribing an officer or something. No, that's anyway, 0. And then the other side, I'm going to copy this formula down. I'm going to copy this formula down. I'm going to make this green because we're working on this one right now. So the green ones are the ones we're working on. So there we have that. I'm going to put the debit on top. We're going to be debiting the officer compensation or increasing the officer compensation. The other side just simply going to the compensation, which will be decreasing. Now, this amount would come, it should match the W-2s for the officers. So whoever the officers are, the owners, we're going to get their W-2s, check it out, and then we'll pick up that number. I'm going to say it's 180,000. 180,000 on the debit and credit side. Then posting this out will then increase the officer compensation from 0 up to the 180,000. The other side then going to decrease the compensation, and we're just going to move it from one line item to the other. So now we've got the compensation going down to the 520,000 and the officer compensation up to 180, no effect on any of the income line items. If we then go to lucert here and input that in place, what we're going to do is find this line item, which was generated directly from the lucert system and would be black in the system, indicating that it came directly from the data input from the trial balance from QuickBooks. And then when we adjust it, it'll turn blue, meaning we have then adjusted it. Now, there is kind of a concern. You're like, well, what would happen if I input it and then I transfer the numbers from the trial balance into the system again? Will it overwrite it? Will it overwrite the system and change it back to what it was before? I don't believe that it will once we make the change. So we'll test that out just to double check that. So I'm going to go back on over to the detail, and now it's blue because I changed it already, but it would be black before I changed it. And then I'm going to change this to line up to what we have here, which is going to be the 520,000. So I'm going to change this to 520,000. And then the officer compensation, I'm going to put into the officer information. I'm going to say we have 2 people that are being compensated. It doesn't necessarily have to break out 50-50, so I'm just going to say this is going to be 180,000 times 0.6. So let's say 60-40 breakout. This is going to be 108,000. And then we have this minus 180,000, which is 72,000. That 72,000, of course, if I divide that by the 180,000 is the 40%. So then that then should pull in. So if I go back to my forms up top, check it out. Now it's breaking out between these two. Officer compensation 180, 520 for the salaries and wages. Let's check that out to our Excel worksheet. So we have the 520, the 180. That looks correct. Then I would check our 3 net income numbers just to see that, to make sure that nothing changed there. So I'm going to make that a green check. This is the 65,510, 65,510, still 65,510 here. And then if we go on down to page 5 of the 1120S, 85,714, 77,510. So we have the 85,710 and the 77 and the 77,510 and the 85,714. So 85,714, 77,510. So everything on the income side, on the income line items still match out. And that's how I would practice going forward, right? Do it in Excel first and then make one change at a time. Check your income lines. Now let's go back to the trial balance. Let's export it again and say, is it going to override? Is it going to override this line, changing it back to 700 if I export it again? So let's go back to the trial balance and just check that out. So here we see we have the 700,000 that's mapping out to that one line item that we now broke out. Now, we've manually gone in there and entered a blue number, but if I export this again, will it then make any changes to that number? So if I post the return, then post it again, let's say I post this and say, okay, now close this out. some line on balance have been modified since you posted it. So I'm going to say, yes, I want you to post it. Do you want to update the tax return? I'm going to say yes, and then we'll see if it overrides it. So it says one account is posted, so I'm going to say okay. And you can see that it did. It actually overrode it here, changed it back to the 700. And if I go back to the detail and I go to the income for the deductions and I go back down, now it's a black 700 and we'll be out of balance. So that's kind of a concern. You're going to have to adjust it within the mapping system. You can't just fix it. We can't just go over here and fix it, because then if we import it again, then it's gonna override. So I want to fix it in basically the trial balance up top too. So I'll do that up top. So I'll enter the same entry basically in here in the tax side of things. So I'm going to say that we need to add a journal entry. And so I want to make sure it's a tax entry this time. And I'm going to have a new account that we need to set up. And it's going to be, for the account number, this is going to be officer compensation. And then it's going to be an expense type of account, and the unadjusted balance is 0. So I'm going to say okay. So we have officer compensation is going to be increased by the 180,000. And then the other side is going to be going to the compensation. So there it is. I'm going to say okay, and then I'm going to say save and close. And then we have our adjustment. There's the 520,000, and then here's the 180. So that ties out to what we have on our Excel worksheet. So I just entered the same kind of transaction. It's in a little bit different order, but that's fine. So then I'm going to say, all right, let's take a look at the mapping. Tax line mapping for the new account is not mapped out. It's red because it's not mapped out. Now, I already entered it into the system, and I have to break out between the two officers anyways. So I'm okay that it's basically not mapped out. So I'm okay with that side. The other side should still be mapping out to the proper account. We just changed the number to it now. So now this one is just going to be a different number. Let's go ahead and post it and then see if we're back to where we should be. And then every time we make an adjustment here to the trial balance, it's not going to override what we have thus far. So then if I go back to the forms and I scroll down, so now we're back to the 520 and the 180. That looks good. And if I go to the data input form for the deductions and go to that amount for the wages, that's now hard coded, or it's not hard. It's black, meaning it came from the data input system of the 520. So we actually fixed it with a journal entry so that when it won't override what's in there already. So there's the 520, and so we still line up. It looks like everything lines up. There's the 65 510, and there's the 85 and the 77 510. So whenever you make an adjustment, I would still make the adjustment here on the tax side, and then we might have to make it on the lucert side as well to make sure that it doesn't kind of overwrite the changes that we manually make in the tax return.